Finding the lowest caffeine tea can be a daunting task, but very important if your goal is to lower your overall caffeine intake. In this video, we're going to be making a list of the teas with lowest caffeine and ranking them by how much caffeine they contain per serving. We'll also give you some tips on how to find the lowest caffeine tea and how to prepare teas with less caffeine. Before we get started, it would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to this YouTube channel and like this video to see more like it in the future. If you'd prefer to read about this topic, we have a great blog article and we'll put the link in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. List of the lowest caffeine teas. Number 1. Herbal teas like chamomile, ginger, and peppermint. Of course, the tea with the lowest caffeine would be the caffeine-free herbal infusions. These are not technically considered teas because they are not from the Camellia sinensis plant, but we thought we'd include them on the lowest caffeine tea list anyways to give you a caffeine-free alternative. Rather than being called teas, these herbal infusions are referred to as tisanes, coming from the Greek word tisane, meaning crushed barley. Almost all these drinks are caffeine-free, with some notable exceptions, and we'll discuss that later on our lowest caffeine tea list. Number 2. Oolong tea. Oolong tea tends to be made from the older leaves of the tea plant, making it one of the lowest caffeine tea types. Oolong is perhaps the most processed of the tea types, so it's possible to use older tea leaves and still end up with a smooth, flavorful tea. While white teas and green teas are really a celebration of the simplicity of tea, Oolong is more about nuance and complexity. The leaves are bruised to bring the enzymes to the surface of the leaf and speed up the oxidation. Then they are heated to stop the oxidation. The end result is a tea that is partially oxidized, and it can take on these flowery or even spicy flavor profiles. As you may know by now, the lowest caffeine tea would be the one that's made from the older leaves, so Oolong can fit the bill here. The High Mountain Oolong will be the tea with lowest caffeine, and Oolongs that use the buds of the tea plant will be the highest caffeine teas. Number 3. Puerh or Hojicha. Dark teas or post-fermented teas can be some of the lowest caffeine tea types. This is because these teas are mostly made from the older tea leaves and they can be fermented for years or even decades after packaging. During the post-fermentation process, the caffeine in the leaves are broken down, meaning that the tea aged for the longest time will be the lowest caffeine tea, and the tea aged for the shortest time will be the highest caffeine tea in terms of Hojicha. Next, we have black tea. Black teas are fully oxidized, meaning that after they are picked, they are allowed to oxidize naturally. During this oxidation process, the enzymes convert the catechins into theaflavins and thearubicins. Black tea isn't necessarily considered the tea with the lowest caffeine or the tea with the highest caffeine, but it actually encompasses a broad range. A black tea made from the buds of the tea plant, like a Genmaicha, will be quite high in caffeine, whereas a black tea made from the older leaves will be among one of the lowest caffeine tea types. Next, we have white tea. The name white tea comes from the silver buds of the tea plant that are often used in white tea blends. White tea is not simply a tea made from buds, but rather a solar withered tea with minimal processing. The tea leaves are picked and dried out in the sun to slow the oxidation process. A white tea made with just the older, more mature leaves will be the lowest caffeine tea, and a tea made from just the white buds will be the highest caffeine tea. Next, we have green tea. Green tea is a broad category, encompassing some of the lower caffeine teas as well as some of the highest caffeine teas. While premium Japanese green teas like gyokuro, sencha, and matcha are some of the highest caffeine teas in the world, there are a few options when it comes to Japanese green teas that are much lower in caffeine, and we're going to cover a few of them here. First, we have Genmaicha. Genmaicha is a popular blended tea made by combining toasted rice with green tea leaves. This originated as a way to save money and make tea supplies last longer, but it soon became celebrated as a great tasting tea in its own right. The toasted rice gives it these nice tasting notes of warm cereal and popcorn that can be quite pleasant both in the morning as well as the afternoon. Because the toasted rice doesn't contain any caffeine, and the tea is often made from older leaves, these teas tend to be very low in caffeine, with an 8-ounce cup containing around 18 milligrams of caffeine. A small cup of coffee will have 100 milligrams of caffeine, so Genmaicha is definitely on the lower end of the caffeine spectrum. Kukicha. Kukicha is another green tea with the lowest caffeine. The caffeine is produced by the tea plant in order to protect the leaves from the insects. Because the leaves are more vulnerable, the caffeine is concentrated around the leaves and not the stems. Teas made by combining the stems and leaves are therefore much lower in caffeine, and they can have a unique flavor to them with notes of summergrass and straw. Sometimes the addition of the stems can create a milder, more drinkable tea without these powerful vegetable notes. A good example of this is a tea like karigane, made from the stems and leaves of the gyokuro plant. While many first-time green tea drinkers find gyokuro to be a bit overpowering, karigane is a great beginner's tea because it balances out the leaves with the stems. It also brings the caffeine content down, so you can enjoy it later on in the day. A regular Kukicha tea made from unshaded tea plants will have around 18 milligrams of caffeine per cup. But because karigane is made from shaded tea plants, it can have up to 33 milligrams of caffeine per cup. This still makes both of these stem teas quite low in caffeine and definitely suitable for those who are sensitive to it. Hojicha. Next, we come to one of the more interesting teas on the list, and that is Hojicha. Hojicha is one of the lowest caffeine tea types in Japan. Hojicha is a roasted green tea made by turning the dried leaves and stems of the tea plant in a large pan or in a roasting machine. Like with Genmaicha and Kukicha, this began as a way to make the tea harvest last longer. The leaves and stems not sold in the more premium premium gyokuro and sencha teas were roasted to make a wonderful hojicha. This method began to rise in popularity in the 20th century, and now it's one of the more common types of Japanese green tea. The roasting process gives the tea these warmer notes of coffee, caramel, and chocolate that are quite enjoyable, particularly on a cold day. The leaves and stems used to make hojicha tend to be lower in caffeine anyways, but they also lose some of their caffeine during the roasting process itself. This brings the total caffeine content to around 20 milligrams, or 1/5 a cup of coffee. Bancha. Bancha is the second most popular green tea in Japan after sencha. It's made from the older, more mature leaves of the tea plant. Bancha is one of the lowest caffeine tea types in Japan. As we mentioned before, the tea plant produces caffeine as a defense mechanism to protect itself against insects, but this is mostly to protect the younger, more vulnerable leaves. These older leaves are tougher, and therefore they don't require as much protection. As a result, Bancha has around 30 milligrams of caffeine per cup. It also has a really pleasant flavor to it, with notes of warm wood and popcorn. It makes for a nice snacking tea, as it pairs well with popcorn and mixed nuts. This is definitely something to enjoy at the end of a long day, and it's sometimes drunk alongside a meal to help with digestion. Matcha green tea latte. Finally, we come to the last tea on our green tea list, and that is the matcha green tea latte. While this tea does have more caffeine compared to some of the other ones on the list, it doesn't have as much as you might think. With this latte grade matcha, you get 34 milligrams of caffeine per teaspoon of powder. This means that you can easily enjoy a nice matcha latte in the morning without overdoing it on the caffeine. Latte grade matcha is one of the lowest caffeine tea types in powdered form, much lower than ceremonial grade matcha. Ceremonial grade matcha like the matcha seisui and the matcha washamine are going to be quite high in caffeine. These teas are made from the earlier harvests, which gives them a smoother flavor and more caffeine. If you're mixing your matcha latte with oat milk or soy milk, you actually don't want the flavor to be that smooth. Otherwise, the flavor of the tea will be drowned out by the milk. So if you like matcha lattes in the morning, I'm sure you'll be relieved to know that you can keep enjoying them without getting overly caffeinated. Next, we have Mate and Guayusa. Mate and Guayusa are two species of holly plant native to South America. They both contain high levels of caffeine, and they've been used as stimulants for hundreds of years. Because Mate and Guayusa don't come from the tea plant, Camellia sinensis, they cannot be considered true teas. While most tisanes tend to be teas with lower caffeine, this can be one of the highest caffeine infusions, even more than a high caffeine green tea. 1 cup of yerba mate can contain 180 milligrams of caffeine, while Guayusa can contain even more. This has a lot to do with the preparation, as the drink is typically prepared with a very high leaf to water ratio. First, you fill up a gourd 2/3 of the way with leaves and then pour the hot water in. The drink can then be enjoyed with a bombilla or metal straw that filters out the leaves automatically. What factors influence the caffeine content of tea? First, we have tea varietals. There can be slight variations in caffeine content between tea varietals or cultivars. For example, our most popular gyokuro, the Gyokuro Cha Musume, is from the Yabukita cultivar, which will have around 130 milligrams of caffeine per serving, whereas the Saimidori Gyokuro Cha Meijin will have 140 milligrams per serving. This may not seem like a big deal, but if you're really searching for the tea with lowest caffeine, it can make all the difference. Harvest time. When the tea is harvested can also make a difference in the total caffeine content. The first harvest tea will have the most nutrients, most sweetness, and most caffeine. If you want the tea with the lowest caffeine, you will want to select the later harvest tea. Growing practices. Different growing practices can also affect the caffeine content of a tea. Most notably, when a farmer shades the tea plant, it will produce more caffeine. This is why shaded teas like gyokuro and matcha tend to be the highest in caffeine. When it comes to finding a tea with the lowest caffeine, you will want to go for an unshaded tea. Processing methods. The caffeine content contained within the leaves can't be added during the production process, but it can be reduced. The roasting process will reduce the caffeine content, and so will the aging process. This is why teas like Hojicha and Puerh Tea tend to be lower in caffeine. If you're looking for a lower caffeine tea, you may want to look into ones that are roasted or aged. Water temperature. Of course, the person preparing the tea also has an influence on how much caffeine it has. If you use hotter water, more caffeine will be extracted, and if you use cooler water or cold water, you will extract less caffeine. If your goal is to make the ultimate lowest caffeine tea, you can try cold brewing to extract less caffeine from the leaves. Steep time. Similar to water temperature, steep time also impacts the amount of caffeine extracted from the leaves. The hotter you brew the tea and the longer time you brew the tea, the more caffeine you will extract. So if you want to prepare a tea with less caffeine, you can shorten the brewing time a little bit. Finally, we have the amount of tea leaves. There's one final factor you have influence over, and that is the amount of tea leaves you use, or the leaf to water ratio. Of course, if you use less tea leaves, there is less caffeine to extract. That being said, you will want to use a higher leaf to water ratio to get a richer flavor out of the tea. In other words, if your priority is to make the tea with the lowest caffeine, you can use less leaves, but if you want the tea with the most flavor, you should use more leaves. I hope you have found this guide helpful when it comes to preparing teas with less caffeine. If you'd like to try any of these teas, we put the links in the descriptions below. You can head to our website, neoteas.com, and try as many as you like, and also support this YouTube channel. Another great way to support the channel is by subscribing or liking this video to see more like it in the future. If you have any questions about green tea, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.